In the brutal summer of 1942, when the Eastern Front was swallowing men and machines in equal measure, a group of German engineers stood around a strange object on the edge of a captured Soviet village. The heat was suffocating, the air thick with the stench of oil and burned fields. Before them lay a circular steel disc, roughly welded, chipped with rust, and covered in Soviet markings. To the soldiers who brought it in, it was just another piece of captured enemy scrap. But to the engineers of the Wehrmacht's Weapons Evaluation Unit, it was an object of curiosity, a Soviet anti-tank mine, the TM-35. They had seen plenty of Soviet equipment since the invasion began. Crude rifles, rough armor, inconsistent shells. To them, this mine was no different. It was heavy but simple, nothing like the clean design of the German Tellermine 35. The Germans prided themselves on precision. Their weapons were symmetrical, elegant, industrial masterpieces. The Soviet mine, by comparison, looked as though it had been built in a barn by untrained hands. The welds were uneven, the pressure plate crooked, and the safety mechanism seemed laughably primitive. Around the test site, several officers and engineers chuckled, calling it a peasant's toy. They joked that the Soviets were so desperate they'd fill tin cans with TNT and call them weapons. It was the same arrogance that had colored much of the early German campaign in the East, the belief that Soviet equipment was inferior because it lacked refinement. They didn't yet understand that the Red Army's power lay in function, not beauty. The test range had been set up on a wide, dusty field near Poltava. A captured Soviet T-26 tank, long obsolete by 1942, had been dragged into position. The engineers buried the TM-35 under a few centimeters of soil and armed it according to the notes taken from Soviet manuals. Everything looked so crude that even the German crew operating the test vehicle treated the procedure lightly. The commanding officer lit a cigarette and stood back, grinning as if the entire thing were a practical joke. When the tank engine roared to life, the sound echoed across the empty field. The vehicle rolled forward slowly, its tracks grinding through the dirt. The spectators waited, half expecting the mine to fizzle or misfire. The driver advanced directly over the buried charge, the heavy track pressing down on the ground with more than 10 tons of weight. For a brief moment, nothing happened. Someone laughed. Then the world exploded. A blinding flash ripped through the earth, followed by a violent thunderclap that sent a column of dust and debris shooting skyward. The tank's front track was torn apart. The hull lifted off the ground and slammed back down with a metallic roar. Shards of metal and clods of dirt rained over the spectators. The laughter stopped instantly. The only sound that followed was the echo of the blast rolling across the valley and the hiss of settling dust. When the air cleared, the engineers stared in disbelief. The tank's forward section was shredded. The driver's hatch had been blown open, the suspension twisted like wire. The explosion had carved a deep crater beneath the hull, its edges glowing with heat. They measured it later, nearly half a meter deep. The crude Soviet device had generated a shock force far greater than expected. It was not just effective, it was lethal. The engineers had mocked its simplicity, but in that moment they understood its genius. The mine required no sophistication, no advanced materials, no precision manufacturing. It only needed to work once. The TM-35 was built for war in which quantity and reliability mattered more than elegance. The Soviets had designed a weapon that could be buried by the thousands, made cheaply in any workshop, and still cripple the most advanced tank on Earth. As the sun set over the field, the twisted shell of the test tank cast a long shadow across the scorched earth. The laughter that had filled the morning was gone. In its place was silence, the uneasy realization that the enemy's crude invention had outsmarted their arrogance. The lead engineer wrote a single note in his report that evening. Crude, yes, but efficient. A farmer's tool, not a soldier's toy. The next morning, the testing field still bore the scars of the explosion. The air smelled faintly of burnt metal and gunpowder, and the ground was scattered with fragments from the destroyed tank. The engineers, now more cautious, gathered to examine the crater left behind by the Soviet TM-35 mine. It was deeper than expected, the walls hardened by the force of the blast. Pieces of the tank's suspension and track were fused into the soil. What they had dismissed as an unsophisticated device had produced a detonation far beyond its size. The team began documenting their findings. They measured the radius of the shock wave and analyzed the steel deformation on the tank's hull. The data confirmed what the eye could already see. The Soviet mine had released its energy with extraordinary efficiency. Despite being filled with standard TNT, the explosive yield was amplified by clever shaping of the casing and the placement of the detonator. The mine's design ensured that the blast concentrated directly upward, channeling its power beneath a tank's weakest point, its underside. For the first time, the German specialists understood that the Soviets were not merely improvising. They were adapting. The Red Army's engineers had learned to fight a technologically superior enemy through economy of design. Where German production relied on factories and precision instruments, the Soviets relied on simplicity and scale. The TM-35 was proof of that philosophy. It could be built in any small workshop, using cheap materials, and still cripple the most formidable armor Germany possessed. Throughout the summer of 1942, captured Soviet mines were shipped to research centers across the Reich. The reports were unanimous. These devices were dangerous, cheap, and efficient. Yet disbelief persisted among the higher ranks. They refused to accept that such crude designs could rival the technical excellence of German engineering. The result was a dangerous complacency. Field units continued to underestimate the mines, failing to train crews properly in detection and clearance. But at the front, soldiers were learning the truth through blood and fire. As German tank divisions advanced deeper into Soviet territory, they began encountering minefields that seemed endless. Roads, bridges, even open fields were booby-trapped. Often, mines were laid under destroyed vehicles or hidden beneath corpses, making recovery efforts deadly. The Soviets had turned the land itself into a weapon. At the test range, the engineers decided to repeat the experiment, this time with a heavier tank, a Panzer III, weighing nearly 20 tons. They buried the mine again, set their instruments, and rolled the tank forward. When it passed over the charge, another explosion ripped through the ground. The tank's right track snapped instantly, the drive sprocket shattered, and the entire vehicle listed sideways into the crater. The officers watching from a distance were stunned. The TM-35, though small, had crippled one of the Wehrmacht's most reliable armored vehicles in a single blast. The engineers examined the wreckage closely. Beneath the tank's belly, the armor was cracked and warped from the upward pressure of the explosion. Even without penetrating, the mine's sheer concussive force was enough to immobilize it completely. As word of the tests spread through the engineering corps, attitudes began to shift. The Soviet mine was no longer a curiosity, it was a threat that demanded respect. The laughter that had greeted it only days before was replaced by grim recognition. The Soviets, it seemed, had mastered the art of making simple weapons terrifyingly effective. What unsettled the Germans most was not the mine's destructive power, but its abundance. Soviet supply lines were scattered, yet the mines appeared everywhere. At river crossings, in forests, under snow, even along retreating roads. It was as if the very soil of the East had been armed against them. The engineers began compiling a new report for Berlin, one that would challenge their assumptions about Soviet industry and ingenuity. But before they could finish, another shipment arrived from the front. A new type of mine, wooden, nearly invisible to metal detectors. The label read TM-41. The crate that arrived from the front looked ordinary, its wood weathered and scarred by travel. But when the engineers pried it open, they found something even more unsettling than the TM-35. Inside lay several flat, square boxes made almost entirely of wood, painted in dull green and gray. At first glance, they didn't look like weapons at all, more like crude carpenter's work or discarded planks. Yet these were the new Soviet TM-41 mines, an evolution of the earlier model. Their simplicity was even more astonishing. The TM-41 contained no metal casing. Its structure was built from thin plywood, its internal mechanism composed mostly of compressed wood and the small fittings. Only the detonator and charge core were metallic. The purpose of this design was immediately clear. Such mines could not be easily detected by standard German mine detectors, which relied on magnetism to locate buried steel. This was no accident. It was strategic adaptation. The Soviets had learned quickly how to exploit the enemy's methods. The lead engineer, now far more cautious than during the first test, ordered a controlled detonation. The mine was buried under 2 centimeters of soil, connected to remote ignition. When triggered, it produced a violent explosion, nearly equal to the TM-35, but with less metallic shrapnel and more concussive force. The resulting crater was broad and deep, proof that the Soviets had perfected their explosives mixtures. The engineers realized with growing unease that these mines could be manufactured anywhere, even in the simplest conditions. A carpenter's shed, a school workshop, a rail yard. The Wehrmacht's field reports began to tell similar stories. Tank crews advancing through rural areas found that their detectors were failing. Vehicles exploded without warning on roads that had been cleared the day before. Soldiers started calling them ghost mines because they couldn't see them, couldn't detect them, and couldn't predict where they'd strike. German sappers, tasked with clearing paths, developed a deep fear of these invisible weapons. They resorted to probing the ground with bayonets, moving inch by inch. Casualties among engineering units began to climb. The psychological effect was devastating. The fear of the unseen enemy beneath one's feet. For every tank destroyed, dozens of soldiers were lost trying to make the road safe again. Back at the test facility, the engineers studied the design's evolution. The TM-41's simplicity made it lighter and easier to conceal. The wooden casing absorbed sound, reducing detection even from dogs and acoustic equipment. Soviet engineers had stripped away every unnecessary element, leaving behind pure functionality. Nothing elegant, but terrifyingly effective. By late autumn, new variants began appearing across the Eastern Front. Some were pressure mines, others magnetic or even improvised explosives, built from captured German ordnance. The Red Army's approach was clear: adaptability at all costs. Their engineers were not constrained by convention. They built weapons suited to their environment: cold, wet, and endless. At headquarters, the reports from field units began to carry a tone of desperation. Commanders complained that every retreating Soviet division seemed to leave behind a minefield that stretched for kilometers. Entire tank battalions were immobilized not by combat, but by fear of what lay underfoot. Mines forced the Wehrmacht to slow down, to probe, to hesitate, the very opposite of blitzkrieg. The engineers who once mocked Soviet craftsmanship now worked long hours trying to design countermeasures. They tested new detectors, heavier armor skirts, and modified tracks. But no matter how many adjustments they made, the mines remained a step ahead. In one late November test, they buried both a TM-35 and a TM-41 beneath identical soil layers. When a Panzer IV rolled over the first, the explosion disabled it. When it passed over the second, the blast tore its track completely free. The wooden mine, invisible to the eye in the machine, had done more damage. The engineers stood in silence. The lesson was no longer about design or production. It was about understanding an enemy who could turn simplicity into supremacy. And even as they studied these weapons, Soviet sappers on the other side of the front were already developing something new. A mine designed not just to destroy tanks, but to terrify the men who drove them. By the spring of 1943, the Eastern Front had transformed into a landscape of traps. Every road, every ruined village, every patch of earth seemed capable of erupting beneath the boots or treads of advancing troops. The Germans, who once moved with mechanical precision, now crawled across the steppe with nervous caution. Their mine detectors clicked endlessly. Their engineers probed the dirt with trembling hands. The Soviets had turned the land itself into a silent ally. At the research field in occupied Poland, German engineers examined the newest Soviet creation, the TM-43. This was no longer the crude, uneven mine that had once provoked laughter. It was heavier, refined by wartime experience, its casing pressed steel rather than welded plate. The Soviets had taken every lesson learned from the TM-35 and TM-41 and shaped them into a weapon of remarkable efficiency. What made it particularly terrifying was its stability. It could remain buried for months, even years, and still detonate perfectly when triggered. The engineers set up another test. The mine was placed carefully under frozen soil, mimicking real battlefield conditions. Overhead, a Panzer IV was positioned to roll across it at full weight. The moment the track pressed down, the mine ignited. The explosion was sharper than before, the blast column narrower but more focused. The engineers noted with quiet alarm how the TM-43 seemed designed to channel its force upward with precision, enough to rip through the underbelly of a tank. When the dust cleared, the Panzer lay crippled. The engineers measured the armor breach, nearly 8 centimeters deep where the blast had struck. The charge had effectively liquefied the steel, punching a molten hole through what had once been considered impenetrable. Even without direct penetration, the shock wave would have killed the crew instantly. In reports sent to Berlin, the findings were blunt. The Soviets had perfected a balance between simplicity, power, and reliability. Their mines required no delicate components, no specialized materials. They could be mass-produced by untrained laborers under bombardment. And yet they achieved a level of lethality that rivaled German precision engineering. The Soviets were fighting a war not of quality, but of endurance. And they were winning that war beneath the ground. On the front, this reality became nightmare. German tank crews, once confident in their armor, began to dread every unmarked road. Units delayed their movements until mine-sweeping patrols had passed, but even those were often destroyed. The Soviets had begun layering their minefields, hiding anti-personnel charges above anti-tank ones. The first explosion would draw rescuers or engineers. The second would kill them. It was a tactic as brutal as it was effective. Psychological reports from Wehrmacht divisions described growing fear among armored crews. Veterans confessed to hearing phantom clicks under their tanks, to imagining detonations where none existed. Mines didn't just destroy machines, they destroyed momentum. The Soviet defense had found a weapon that didn't need to fire to win. In one chilling instance, a captured Soviet sapper revealed the doctrine behind their mining strategy. They called it defense in the earth. The idea was simple. Make every meter of ground cost the enemy more than it was worth. It wasn't about individual explosions. It was about exhaustion. At the testing ground, the German engineers no longer laughed during detonation. They took cover, flinching as each explosion rippled through the soil. The fascination that had once filled their notebooks was now replaced by apprehension. They understood that these weapons were not temporary measures. The Soviets were evolving, each mine a little deadlier, a little more cunning than the last. As they prepared their next report, word came from the Eastern Front. Entire German armored columns had been halted near Kursk by fields of buried mines. Hundreds of vehicles disabled before they ever saw the enemy. The minefields had been laid in mathematical patterns, disguised by snow and soil, impossible to clear in time. The Battle of Kursk was about to begin, and beneath that battlefield lay tens of thousands of Soviet mines waiting silently for German steel. By July 1943, the Battle of Kursk was set to decide the fate of the Eastern Front. The Germans, confident in their armored might, prepared the largest tank offensive in history. More than 2,000 panzers stood ready to spearhead Operation Citadel. Yet beneath the rolling plains and wheat fields of Kursk lay an unseen enemy. Over 500,000 Soviet mines, planted with obsessive precision by tens of thousands of sappers. They waited silently, hidden under dirt, grass, and the morning dew, turning the earth itself into a weapon. German intelligence had reported the minefields, but few believed their density. Estimates suggested several hundred mines per kilometer, but the true figure was staggering. In some sectors, there were nearly 2,000 mines per square kilometer. Soviet engineers had worked day and night, bearing anti-tank TM-35s and TM-43s alongside smaller anti-personnel PMDS. The result was a layered defense so intricate that every step, every turn of a track could trigger disaster. At dawn on July 5th, the German armored divisions advanced. The first wave of panzers rolled confidently across open terrain. The thunder of engines drowned out the countryside, and for a few brief moments, it seemed that the blitzkrieg spirit had returned. But then came the explosions. One after another, tanks erupted into fireballs. Some lost tracks instantly. Others were flipped sideways by the concussive power of buried charges. Columns stalled, confused. The engineers following behind were thrown into chaos as mines detonated under their clearing vehicles. The smoke grew so thick that tank crews could barely see the fields ahead. The entire front seemed to shudder with invisible thunder. Soviet minefields were designed not only to destroy, but to delay. Each minute that German armor stood immobilized gave Soviet artillery time to zero in. Shells began to rain on the stalled columns, finishing what the mines had started. Reports from the battlefield told of tanks immobilized, crews trapped inside, unable to move or escape as shells tore through the air. At the same time, Soviet sappers continued laying new mines, often at night or even under fire. They operated like ghosts, crawling across the battlefield, repairing broken lines, resetting traps. Their courage became legend among Red Army ranks. Many were killed, but their work never ceased. The Germans began to realize they were not fighting men alone, but an idea, a doctrine of total resistance. At the research facility far from the front, German engineers studied radio intercepts and field reports with grim fascination. The TM-43 had proven devastatingly effective, especially when combined with wooden-cased variants invisible to detection. Some reports described tanks destroyed by mines that had lain dormant for months. The engineers noted the evolution: more sensitive triggers, stronger casings, and new fuses designed to resist freezing temperatures. What struck them most, however, was the Soviet approach to redundancy. For every mine that failed, 3 more stood ready nearby. For every field cleared, another was laid overnight. It was not precision that stopped the German tanks at Kursk, it was persistence. As the battle raged on, the minefields became a symbol of Soviet defiance. The Germans had expected a swift breakthrough, but the earth itself had turned against them. When the offensive finally stalled, over 300 German tanks had been destroyed or disabled, many by mines alone. The sound of distant detonations became the rhythm of the battlefield. Dull thuds that rolled across the plains, marking every failed advance. In the aftermath, the engineers returned to their reports in silence. Their data confirmed what the frontline soldiers already knew. Soviet anti-tank mines had changed the very nature of mechanized warfare. They were no longer secondary weapons. They were strategic tools capable of halting entire armies. The laughter that had greeted the first Soviet mine a year earlier had been buried under the weight of Kursk's explosions. And in Berlin, officials began to ask a question that few dared to answer. How could such simple weapons bring the Reich's finest machines to a standstill? When the smoke from Kursk finally settled, the German engineers faced a grim reckoning. The battlefield had become an open-air laboratory of destruction. Thousands of burned-out tanks and shattered vehicles littered the plains, silent monuments to the underestimated Soviet mine. What had begun as a test curiosity had evolved into a strategic weapon that reshaped the course of mechanized warfare. The engineers sent to recover data from the wreckage were overwhelmed by what they saw. The earth was torn apart. Craters overlapped like scars. Each depression in the ground told a story. A tank stopped mid-charge, a crew extinguished in an instant, a machine worth tens of thousands of marks destroyed by a device made of wood and scrap metal. The German recovery teams worked in eerie silence, noting the patterns of destruction. They found that most tanks had been immobilized before they ever faced Soviet fire. Many crews had died without ever seeing the enemy. The engineering reports that followed were clinical but heavy with unease. The TM-43, they wrote, demonstrated exceptional explosive concentration and upward pressure. But what concerned them most was the durability. Mines that should have degraded after months in the soil still functioned perfectly. Even after rain, frost, and constant vibration from artillery, the Soviet mines detonated with almost mechanical precision. The secret they discovered was in the sealing. Soviet engineers had begun coating fuses in asphalt and wax mixtures, preventing moisture from spoiling the mechanism. It was crude chemistry, yet brilliantly effective. These findings contradicted everything the Germans believed about industrial superiority. Their own mines were complex, costly, and required trained technicians to assemble. The Soviet versions were built by farmers, students, and factory workers in hidden workshops under bombardment. Still, they worked, and they could be made by the tens of thousands every month. Across the front, the Wehrmacht began deploying new countermeasures: heavier mine rollers, explosive charges to clear paths, even captured prisoners forced to probe the soil ahead of advancing armor. But nothing could fully neutralize the problem. The Soviets adapted faster, mixing wooden and metal mines, stacking layers, even creating decoys that triggered multiple explosions. It became a battle of wits fought in silence beneath the ground. Psychological strain began to take hold among German tank crews. Reports described men refusing to drive forward, fearing that every shadow or patch of disturbed earth hid a mine. Veterans began developing rituals before advances, touching insignias, avoiding certain tracks, or marking safe paths that often turned out deadly hours later. Even when minefields were cleared, the fear remained. The sound of a single explosion anywhere nearby could paralyze an entire column. At Peenemünde and Königsberg, where advanced German weapons research was underway, the reports on Soviet mine design were circulated quietly among analysts. Some scientists scoffed at them, dismissing the Red Army's methods as brute force tactics. But others, the ones who understood the psychological side of warfare, saw the deeper brilliance. The Soviets were not trying to out-engineer Germany. They were outlasting it. They had made weapons that could be built fast, buried anywhere, and maintained by men with shovels instead of factories. The mines were not merely tools of defense. They were a philosophy, a declaration that even the ground could become a soldier. By early 1944, as the Red Army prepared for its next great push westward, Soviet engineers were already experimenting with new detonator types. Magnetic, tilt rod, and even anti-handling fuses meant to kill anyone who tried to disarm them. These innovations marked the next stage of evolution, minds that could think in silence, waiting for the smallest touch to awaken. The Germans would soon learn that the worst was yet to come, because the Soviets had realized that a mine didn't just need to stop a tank, it could terrify an army. By the summer of 1944, the Red Army was no longer merely defending. It was advancing, westward, across lands it had once lost, pushing the Wehrmacht back toward its own borders. Yet the soil they left behind remained deadly. Soviet engineers had turned retreat into trap and pursuit into peril. Even as the front moved, the earth continued to fight. Abandoned roads, crossroads, and bridges became graveyards for tanks that dared to follow too quickly. For the Germans, every kilometer of reclaimed territory came at the cost of shattered steel. The minefields, which had once been defensive, were now being used offensively. Soviet forces laid fresh mines during advances, embedding them behind their own lines to stall counterattacks. This strategy turned mobility, the very essence of German warfare, into vulnerability. A tank could no longer rush forward without risking instant annihilation. The Red Army had mastered a weapon that didn't need to aim, didn't need to reload, and didn't need to retreat. In East Prussia, a group of German engineers received captured examples of new Soviet designs. One was a TM-44, the successor to the TM-43, heavier, sturdier, and filled with a higher explosive load. Its detonation plate had been redesigned to trigger under broader pressure ranges, making it nearly impossible for tanks to avoid. The engineers examined the casing, forged steel this time, not welded scrap. Soviet industry had matured even under the endless strain of war. What once had been mocked as primitive was now engineered with precision born of necessity. When tested, the TM-44 obliterated a Panzer IV's lower hull in a single blast. The engineers watched through binoculars as a column of flame and black smoke erupted beneath the tank. The vehicle lifted slightly before slamming down, smoke curling from its ruptured belly. They didn't cheer, didn't comment. They just stared. The evolution was undeniable. The Soviet mine had gone from a farmer's tool of improvisation to an industrial weapon of destruction. At the front, the toll was catastrophic. Reports from the German 4th Panzer Army described routes rendered impassable. Entire supply columns halted for days. Mines had become so numerous that even retreating was dangerous. The Soviets, understanding German habits, began burying delayed action mines along expected withdrawal routes, ensuring that every step backward bled the enemy further. For the soldiers on the ground, the experience was nightmarish. They described landscapes that seemed alive, where every patch of soil might conceal death. The clicking of a detector, the crunch of boots, even the rustle of wind through grass became unbearable. Some men began hallucinating the faint ticking of timers or imagined the ground pulsing beneath them. The mine war was no longer only physical, it had become psychological. In Berlin, the technical departments reviewed the engineers' findings from East Prussia with growing dread. They realized that while Germany had invested vast resources into rockets and tanks, the Soviets had perfected something far more sustainable. Their weapons were cheap, adaptable, and everywhere. The mine, in its quiet simplicity, had become the true weapon of total war. A confidential report circulated among high command late that year summarized the situation in stark terms. Our tanks now fear the earth itself. The phrase spread among troops like a grim prophecy. Crews began referring to the Eastern Front not as a battlefield, but as a graveyard. The soldiers had come to believe the land was haunted by Soviet sappers, by unseen explosives, by the vengeance of the soil itself. And as the Red Army crossed the Vistula, preparing for its final march toward Berlin, the engineers who once mocked Soviet designs faced the truth. What had started as laughter in a test field 2 years earlier had become a lesson carved into metal and memory. The ground beneath them had turned against them, and it was winning. By the autumn of 1944, Soviet engineers were no longer working in secrecy or desperation. They were working with purpose. The Red Army's advance into Eastern Europe was supported by entire brigades of combat engineers whose weapons were measured not in barrels or bullets, but in buried steel and TNT. Behind every line of advancing tanks, teams of sappers followed, laying mines as methodically as if they were planting crops. Their hands were cracked from frost, their uniforms torn, but their resolve was absolute. To the Soviet command, mines had become a language, a means of communication written into the very soil. When German armor pushed forward, it found itself reading messages written in fire and thunder. Minefields marked where the Red Army had been, where it intended to stop, and where it planned to kill. Every retreating German unit now assumed that the ground before them was lethal. That assumption, more than the mines themselves, slowed their advance to a crawl. Captured documents later revealed the extent of Soviet organization. Entire departments within the Red Army were dedicated to mine warfare. They calculated placement density by terrain, by vehicle type, by morale. Their manuals described not just how to kill tanks, but how to break the will of the soldiers inside them. A mine did not need to explode to succeed. It only needed to make the enemy afraid to move. In newly liberated territories, Soviet factories were rebuilt to mass-produce the TM-44 and its wooden variants. Children, women, and old men worked in shifts to fill casings with TNT, sealing each one with tar and rope. Even when supply lines faltered, production never stopped. When German intelligence intercepted reports of Soviet output, they were stunned. The Red Army was producing mines at a rate of hundreds of thousands per month, enough to lay new fields faster than the Germans could clear them. In the field, German engineers fought a losing battle against the unseen. Their mine detectors, though improved, were still nearly useless against wooden-cased devices. Entire companies of sappers were lost to hidden traps. Some mines were now equipped with secondary fuses that detonated when disturbed, anti-handling mechanisms that killed the very men trying to disarm them. The Germans nicknamed them Teufelsminen, devil's mines. The psychological effect grew unbearable. Tank commanders refused to advance without a full sweep ahead, but even cleared zones claimed lives. Each explosion tore more than metal. It tore discipline, confidence, and hope. As autumn turned to winter, the Wehrmacht found itself cornered in a war not of movement, but of paralysis. Every victory cost time, and time was something the Reich no longer had. At the testing facility in Königsberg, the German engineers continued to receive new samples from the front. The latest was an anti-lift variant, triggered by the slightest attempt to remove it. Its fuse design was so simple, yet so ingenious, that even disarmed mines sometimes exploded minutes later from residual pressure. When one detonated unexpectedly during a controlled test, killing 2 technicians, the surviving engineers halted their work for days. The weapon had turned the study of science into an encounter with fear. In their final assessments, they wrote that Soviet mines represented the democratization of destruction. Anyone could build one, anyone could bury one, and once in the ground, no one could predict its moment of awakening. By the end of 1944, entire German divisions were immobilized not by the Red Army's guns, but by its patience. The mines waited, silent and eternal, beneath the frozen mud of Poland and Belarus. Each explosion that echoed across the front was a reminder that Soviet warfare had moved beyond speed and technology. It had entered the realm of inevitability. And in that silence beneath the snow and steel, the earth itself seemed to breathe with vengeance. As 1945 began, the war was turning against Germany from every direction. The Allies pressed from the west, while in the east the Red Army was preparing its final, unstoppable advance toward Berlin. Between the Germans and their capital stretched a landscape already conquered by the Soviets' most relentless weapon, the mine. Thousands of square kilometers of Poland and East Prussia had become death traps, every field seeded with invisible explosives. For the soldiers of the collapsing Wehrmacht, even retreat was a gamble with fate. When Soviet troops crossed the Vistula River in January, their advance moved behind a familiar sound, the muffled thump of explosions echoing through frozen soil. German tanks attempting counterattacks found themselves crippled before contact was ever made. Columns of refugees and retreating soldiers followed mined roads unknowingly, many never reaching the next village. The ground itself had become an army, silent, merciless, and patient. At the same time, the German engineers who had once mocked the Soviet TM-35 now worked in ruined laboratories under candlelight, attempting to design countermeasures that no longer mattered. The Reich's cities were burning, resources were gone, and production lines had collapsed. Yet the Soviets continued to improve their mines. Reports spoke of new fuse designs resistant to freezing, others triggered by vibration rather than pressure. Even when disarmed, many mines detonated from the faintest shift in air or touch of light. It was no longer a question of if a tank would be stopped, but when. In Silesia, an entire German armored regiment was halted outside a small town after its lead vehicle detonated a TM-44. When the following tanks attempted to maneuver around the wreck, more explosions followed. Within minutes, a dozen vehicles were immobilized, their crews either killed or trapped inside. The survivors abandoned the machines and fled on foot, leaving behind columns of smoke rising into the gray winter sky. The mines had not only destroyed tanks, they had destroyed the idea of armored dominance that had defined German warfare since 1939. Soviet engineers, meanwhile, followed the advancing front with the efficiency of an assembly line. They cleared the roads for their own vehicles, then mined them again behind their lines to prevent German counterattacks. Their doctrine of defense in the earth had evolved into something even broader. Movement through fire. Mines were no longer just barriers. They were instruments of control, dictating where the enemy could or could not exist. In Königsberg, the last German test team recorded their final entry in a battered logbook. The minefield has replaced the fortress. The enemy no longer defends walls. He defends the ground itself. Shortly after, the facility was evacuated as Soviet artillery approached the city. The engineers left behind their instruments, their unfinished reports, and a few recovered mines, silent trophies of a war already lost. By the time the Red Army reached the Oder River, minefields stretched like scars across the map of Europe. Every approach to Berlin had been fortified, every road watched by explosives buried months earlier. German officers who once mocked the crude Soviet mine now gave orders to avoid open ground entirely. The weapon that had once been a joke at a sunny test field in Ukraine had become one of the deadliest tools of the war, a symbol of Soviet endurance and industrial will. The engineers who first laughed at it were now scattered, their empire crumbling around them, their tanks burning above the very devices they had dismissed. As Soviet troops prepared for the final push into the Reich's capital, a new wave of mines was laid along their flanks, not to stop them, but to protect them from what remained of the German resistance. The war had turned full circle. The mine was no longer just the defender's weapon. It was now the shadow that followed victory. And beneath the frozen ground, in forests and fields stretching all the way to the gates of Berlin, tens of thousands of them still waited, patient, silent, and loyal only to the soil that held them. When the Red Army finally entered Berlin in April 1945, the thunder of artillery and tank fire rolled over a city already half buried in rubble. The once proud streets of the Reich's capital were scarred by shell fire, cratered by bombs, and mined by both sides in a desperate final contest of survival. Every corner, every pile of debris hid a potential death trap. The ground, long weaponized by the Soviets, now claimed its final victims among the ruins of the empire that had once laughed at its power. German engineers, those who had survived the collapse, witnessed the end of their technological faith. The empire built on precision and superiority had been undone by weapons born of necessity, weapons that required no luxury, no perfection, only determination. They had tested the Soviet mind to mock it, but in the end, it had taught them the cruelest lesson of all. Simplicity in war could be more lethal than sophistication. The final weeks of fighting saw Soviet sappers working in Berlin's shattered outskirts, clearing paths through the wreckage while planting new mines to secure their gains. They moved methodically, silently, under the cover of smoke and dust. Many of them had marched from the steppes of the Volga or the forests of Smolensk, carrying the same designs that had stopped German armor years earlier. For them, the mine was not merely a tool, it was the companion of their journey from defeat to victory. When the guns finally fell silent on May 9, 1945, and the red banner rose above the Reichstag, the mine remained, unseen, buried, still armed. Beneath the soil of Europe lay millions of them, waiting in the silence of peace. They had done their work too well. Farmers plowing fields in the years to come would find them beneath the roots of wheat. Children playing in abandoned villages would uncover them in the grass. The war was over, but its echo lived beneath the earth. For the engineers who survived, both Soviet and German, the lessons endured. The Soviets continued to refine their designs, turning the wartime TM series into the foundation of modern mine warfare. The Germans, now rebuilding under occupation, studied those same weapons not as enemies, but as students of a grim science. The mine had reshaped the doctrine of armies worldwide. A weapon that needed no army to wield it, no soldier to fire it. It waited, patient and impartial, long after men and nations were gone. Historians would later describe the Eastern Front as a war of endurance, where technology clashed with willpower and where the earth itself became a participant in battle. The Soviet anti-tank mine embodied that struggle perfectly. Born in scarcity, dismissed in arrogance, and proven in blood, it had turned every inch of soil into a potential fortress. In the years that followed, demining operations across Eastern Europe uncovered hundreds of thousands of unexploded mines. Many bore the same markings as the one the German engineers had tested back in 1942. The crude welds, the uneven edges, the Soviet star stamped into the casing. Each was a relic of a forgotten duel between intellect and instinct, between precision and endurance. Decades later, a few of those early test reports survived in dusty archives, faded papers that began with notes of mockery and ended with words of respect. One line, written in the final months of the war, summed it up best. "We laughed at the weapon of peasants, and it buried our empire beneath its silence." The story of the Soviet mine was not one of invention, but of persistence. The will of a nation forged in fire and hunger, transforming the simplest idea into the deadliest truth. And so the engineers' laughter from that summer day in 1942 faded into history, replaced by the eternal quiet of the earth that still remembers what was buried within it. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.